thank you for coming up with those lovely slides. I think I could talk to those slides, in fact, if I had to improvise, but I'll go on with my prepared talk. Maybe it is a pity that we just call it Australia and the Pacific. The title that I used, it was the title of my thesis, which is Overseeing and Overlooking, which is my pithy way of describing how Australia engages with the Pacific. It oversees what goes on, but it also overlooks what goes on. But anyway, let me begin as I intended. On the morning of 24th of July 2003, I was sleeping on an old wooden yacht in Honiara, but I was woken by the unfamiliar sound of a helicopter flying overhead. Stepping on the deck of the boat, I could see an Australian Navy vessel just out to sea. This was the HMS Manura, and what I was witnessing was the launch of a radical new and muscular form of Australian engagement with the Pacific that would become the subject of my PhD thesis and indeed inform much of my topic tonight. During the 6 months I spent in Solomon Islands in 2003, I came to understand the preeminent role that Australia plays in Solomon Islands and feel the frustration that Pacific Islanders often feel at Australian insensitivity and ineffectiveness in fulfilling that role. I followed the release of the influential report entitled Our Failing Neighbour and the radical departure in Australian engagement that the intervention in Solomon Islands heralded. Choosing to make Australian engagement with the Pacific Islands the subject of my doctoral research, I imagined that I would discover Australian duplicity and callousness. I soon found that these characteristics, while certainly present, only capture a small part of the story of Australia's approach to the Pacific Islands. In this short talk then, I will be taking you a little bit through my personal journey as well as its written expression in the form of my thesis, which, if you're interested in reading more, can be downloaded from Melbourne Uni website just by googling Overseeing and Overlooking. So when I began my PhD research, which I began in 2005, I quickly realised that the radical departure that I'd seen in 2003, far from being a singular occurrence, was in fact a regular aspect of Australian engagement in the Pacific. Thus, for example, in 1988, the new incoming Foreign Minister, Gareth Evans, made such a departure with some fanfare when he introduced what he called constructive commitment. Gareth Evans' constructive commitment would seek to balance Australia's evident overwhelming superiority in power with sensitivity in the exercise of that power, respect for the sovereignty of the Pacific Island states, many of which at the time had only fairly recently gained their independence. But a mere 5 years later, in 2003, Gareth Evans turned his attention to Cambodia, and his junior minister with responsibility for Pacific Island affairs, the late Gordon Bilney, announced a new tough love message in which Australian aid, hitherto given more or less with no questions, would henceforth be conditional on Pacific Islands adopting sound economic and environmental policies. In 1996, the newly elected Howard government adopted a still more muscular approach to the Pacific Islands, following the Sandline affair, which, for those of you who do not remember, was when the Papua New Guinea government was found to have retained the services of a private military company, which was at the time the term mercenaries was used fairly liberally, to prosecute us for in Bougainville. The Australian government at that time unleashed quite a naked display of Australian power to encourage the Papua New Guinea government to abandon its plans and ultimately helped cause the downfall of the Chan government. And of course, in 2003, we have Ramsey and the policies of what Foreign Minister Alexander Downer called cooperative intervention. The Enhanced Cooperation Program in Papua New Guinea, a program of sending bureaucrats and police to help the Papua New Guineans manage their affairs of government. Intervention in Vanuatu, uninvited one might add, intervention in Vanuatu, and helped cause the downfall of the government of the day, of Prime Minister Serge Bourgois. Along with this new approach came what they called a whole-of-government approach, which see greater enmeshment of the Australian government with its Pacific Island counterparts. So I decided to investigate a hypothesis that, as Mark Twain has been quoted as saying, history doesn't repeat, but it certainly does rhyme. So now I'm going to do a little bit of the fairly dry academic stuff and tell you how I came to do this approach. The standard the standard way to start, as you're probably aware, is to look at what other people have said and decide how, what to make of it. After all, if someone else has already done the research, why would I do it? So what I found very quickly was that every time there's some dramatic key event, coup in Fiji in 1987, 2000, and 2006, the Sandline affair I just referred to in 1997, or in 2003, every time something like this happens, we find a plethora of analyses. Suddenly everyone's writing about the Pacific. But in between, we find that the journalists continue to do their job, but the analysts, they find little to write about. But the point is that, like Australian engagement itself, as I will argue, the analysis of that engagement tends to be quite episodic. So the journalistic, so in between these key events, what we find is that the reporting on the Pacific tends to be essentially in a journalistic style. Now, nothing against journalistic style. We need to know what's happening, but we need also someone to put it into a larger framework. Journalistic writing, by its very nature, tends to emphasise the reactive nature. This one did this, this one did this, this one did this, this one did this. Epitomised in commentator Graham Dobell's description of Australian policy making as ad hoc. In Dobell's analysis, we have Australia says it's doing one thing. What it's actually doing is just responding to events on the ground. Periodically, we go, oh, these two don't match, so we adjust what we say we're doing to match what we're actually doing. And we can call this ad hocery taken to its sort of logical conclusion. There are, however, a number of other more systematic analyses of Australian engagement, which I'll just classify into 5 groups. We have your basic sort of Marxist-inspired analysis that is Australian commercial interests that drive the way Australia engages with the Pacific. That is Australian companies, it's their interest in doing business, and the Australian government essentially does the bidding of Australian companies. We have the economic liberals, who emphasise once again the economic side of the engagement, but see it more as a win-win kind of situation. Australia funds institutions around the Pacific. It funds the fishing agency, it funds the universities, it funds an enormous number of agencies around the Pacific. Australia benefits by getting some influence, having things going better. Pacific Islands benefit by having all these good things going on. We find a series of analysis that are what in international relations parlance is called a realist analysis. That is to say, one driven by considerations of power politics, that Australia by conventional realist analysis is termed a middle power. That is, it's a medium-sized power surrounded by, or at least in close proximity to much larger Asian powers, and that we have always sought the allegiance of, or to be the ally of great and powerful friends, the United Kingdom, and since World War II, the United States, and that Australian engagement with the Pacific has been driven by the considerations of what that entails for our alliance with the US. It's worth noting that in this analysis, the Pacific Islands figure as merely as pawns. They're not really exercising any influence on what goes on. And then, in a sort of a mirror image of that, we have an analysis which the liberal institutionalist analysis, which says that while there are these power games going on, is actually much more harmonious, much more mutually beneficial. That Australia, for all its overwhelming power, is also constrained in its relationship with the Pacific by regional institutions, by international norms of diplomacy, and by other regional powers, or whether it be the European, the Asian powers, that all of these act as brakes on Australia's potential domination. Finally, we have a sort of a more novel, what's called a new security analysis, which I'm sure some of you have heard of. The idea that, especially since the end of the Cold War, that the traditional sort of military conception of state relations and state power-based relations has given way to one which takes into account human security, economic security, environmental security. We have climate change as a looming problem. We have HIV in the Pacific, and all of these factors Australian policymakers see as with great alarm that the Pacific Islands are going to be affected by these, and wonder how Australia can respond to that. Now, amongst all those, so there I've given you 5 different ways that analysts have looked at Australia's relationship with the Pacific. What they have in common is they don't really look at how Australia makes its decisions. It sees policy making as essentially a black box. We put in these inputs and we get these outputs. And for one, I find that quite problematic. If we can't establish how it is that this input leads to that output, how can we ever know that it did? How can we ever be sure? Because 5 different analyses, 5 radically different analyses, if I by my judgment, all of them have some evidence in their favour, I would say. So how can we do it? So naturally, okay, I'm preempting the answer. The answer is let's have a look at the operation. We'll look at what happens in foreign affairs. We'll look at the way that the Australian political process deals with the inputs, look at the way that it comes up with the outputs. There has been some analysis of Australian engagement with the Pacific that works in that way. The standard textbook on Australian foreign policy, written by Alan Gingell and Michael Wesley, uses in fact the Sandline affair as a kind of a case study and describes in some detail how Australia came to respond in the way that it did. Historian of Solomon Islands, Clive Moore, has looked at the Ramsey intervention, emphasising the role of Alexander Downer's that he played in convincing John Howard that Australia needed to intervene. A number of other analyses have looked at just the role of the way that we think about the Pacific in driving it, the way that we alternately see them as economically challenged or potentially influenceable by, be it the Soviets, be it the Chinese, or the way that it's the way that we think about it that's important. Still, I still have a problem with that way of looking at it. For a start, they all seem to see that Australian policies toward the Pacific is there's something a bit wrong with it. Like there's a right way of doing things and we're doing it wrong, but it doesn't. That's a kind of a negative way of looking at it. It's saying if only we did this, then everything would be good. But once again, to my mind, where's the evidence? Show me the evidence. And we don't really get an idea of why it is that a positive kind of explanation for why what has happened has happened. A couple of other considerations which I'll just throw in, and then we'll get on to something a bit more meaty. One thing we often find in looking at Australian relations in the Pacific is that policies produce outcomes that were not intended. Obviously, this happens all the time, everywhere, unintended outcomes. But, so the argument goes, we have a particular lack of, this is particularly heightened in the case of the Pacific, simply because we don't really understand the Pacific. The knowledge that was built up in the colonial period, all the Kiaps who returned from Papua New Guinea retired, they were never replaced. We got to the point where Australian government had, the last foreign minister who knew anything seriously about Papua New Guinea was Andrew Peacock, and that was some time ago. Just the idea that we don't really know what's going on. Another really interesting thing to look at is that it goes with that not really understanding, is that there's a tendency for Australian actions to be perceived as insensitive. That is, the Pacific Islanders think that we don't really care about them, we don't really understand them, and they respond by not being helpful. Of course, they want the aid, but they don't necessarily want the conditions that go with the aid. So there's a whole literature on what are called the weapons of the weak, the idea that you say you'll do something, but you don't quite do it, you play the fool, respecting the letter but not the spirit of agreements, and in some ways being quite safe in doing so, because in some ways the Pacific Islanders you can draw an analogy, they're like fleas, Australia has to deal with too many of them to be able to go and respond to each time one of them has a government that does something that we don't like. So there's a great chance to get away with the kind of things that annoy the Australian government, and then wind up in a vicious circle. But all of this is just another way of looking at it, and I'm still find myself saying, how do we understand the waxing and waning? How do we understand the, as I said, every couple of years, every 5 years, there's a new approach. None of these analyses really have a way of dealing with a dynamic aspect. So, how can we explain change in policies? If the inputs stay more or less similar, why wouldn't the outputs be more or less similar? Okay, I'm going to give you a little bit more theory here. There's a borrowing from Stephen Jay Gould's The Evolutionary Scientist. He came up with the notion of punctuated equilibrium, the idea, or punctuated equilibria, the idea that policies or systems, in his case, be it species, or in this case, be it Australian policy arrangements toward the Pacific Islands, stay fairly stable, but periodically they jump to a new state. This seems seems a fairly apt description to my mind of what happens, but we still find ourselves wondering how it is that things change. I mean, what would make them jump from one way to another? After all, we don't have any massive turnover of staff. DFAT is still DFAT. We might have a change of government, but the changes don't necessarily correspond to changes of government. It's not entirely clear. But this is where I come up with my the novel part. I think that is to try to stand back from the way that decisions are made, and rather than assuming that when Australia decides to respond in such and such a way to, be it coup in Fiji, be it corruption in Papua New Guinea, is it actually a solution that we come up with in the conventional sense of a rational response to a given input, or is it just someone who's been pushing for a particular policy direction has managed to get their policies through on the back of this, on the back of what a problem has presented itself that needs a solution, and so that they managed to get their solution through the door. And I'm going to argue that this is what happens. That we have a small but very persistent group of advocates who are constantly advocating for different sets of policies, and each time we have one of these changes of approaches, what we're actually witnessing is a group of advocates managing to get their ideas up because they have succeeded in convincing the foreign minister, usually occasionally the prime minister, that what they have is a solution to a problem that's presented itself. And what happens in between, in these phases when we don't change, is that the foreign minister typically is dealing with other problems. The bureaucracy is just carries on. It hasn't got that sort of dynamism to adapt and change and maintain the policy settings. Or actually, that's not quite the word. They maintain them rigidly. They don't have that sort of space to throw ideas around, to evolve, but rather to stick to the script. And because inevitably problems emerge, we get this sort of downturn in enthusiasm and policy stagnation. Okay. So, after studying for many years, 30 years of Australian policy making, what I came up with is, I've made a number of observations. What I found in particular was that many of the features that we associate with Australian Pacific Island policy are episodic rather than constant. That is, there's a regularity about their emergence, which led me into this sort of cyclic model of engagement, which I'm going to explain to you now. Which would emphasise that I'm not trying to be prescriptive about it. This is really only a heuristic in order to sort of help to explain the waxing and waning, or as I call it, the cycling of engagement. So what we observe is that there's every time there's a change of policy, it's preceded by some kind of crisis. Now, I put crisis in inverted commas because this crisis can be real, or it can be manufactured, or it can be sort of some combination of the two. And I would just highlight that to contrast this with other foreign relations with, say, Indonesia, with which there's constantly kind of, well, constantly probably the wrong word, but regularly things happen that might send that relationship off course. But the institutions that maintain it, the international agencies that deal with customs and deal with all these things, they just carry on because they're strong, and that's the difference. That's what makes the Pacific special. It gets thrown off course quite easily. But okay, so we have this crisis. We have these crises. But the key aspect of the crisis is that there's a solution. And the solution in each case, so I've said 1988, I've said 1993, 1996, each of these events that I described earlier has been characterized by crisis. And on each occasion, those that have presented the crisis have presented a solution to that crisis, which has involved Australian re-engagement. But it's always a new re-engagement. It's kind of each time it's now we've understood. Now we've understood something we didn't understand before. It's not an adjustment in policy. It's a new policy, and I mean radical is a bit of an overused word, but it's radically new in the sense that it looks at the problem in a completely different way from the way it was looked at before. Also notable is that each time we have this re-engagement is that it's welcomed. The Australian political community, all of us, typically across the political spectrum, be it whichever government's in power, the opposition supports it, the small but active cohort of journalists and academics at ANU, wildly enthusiastic. In the Pacific, sometimes yes, sometimes no, but generally any engagement is welcomed. There's this strange, I find, sense that the feeling of neglect is so strong that whenever they see Australian engagement, they get enthusiastic about it. However, this engagement never seems to last. I mean, I say it rarely lasts. It's interrupted by, on the one hand, events in the Pacific itself, often in the form of an active resistance to Australia's approach, be it a troublesome Prime Minister in Solomon Islands, or a coup in Fiji. Well, no, sorry, the coup in Fiji. Sorry, the coup in Fiji was not done to get to Australia. I'm not suggesting that at all. Or it could be an event which was not related to Australian engagement, but which nonetheless disturbed, upset, threw off course Australia's approach. That's one way that we get derailed. The other way we get derailed, and this happens all too often, is that different policy objectives emerge in Australia. And the archetype of this has to be the Pacific solution. In 2001, when the Howard government determined that it wanted to prevent irregular boat arrivals from reaching Australian territory, and that it wanted to establish detention centres, offshore detention centres, it effectively offered what amounts to bribes to Pacific Island countries to take these, to take the detention centres. That is, the carefully worked out policies of governance, of aid in exchange for good policy settings and so on, was effectively banned is probably is a strong word, but that's largely what happened. Suddenly it became more important to have a detention centre than it was to maintain it. So I argue that every time in this cycle, the kind of Australian policy settings being thrown off course has been caused by either an event in the Pacific or by these some kind of different policy objectives. I'll go through some more examples shortly. But occasionally, the engagement does become, I would call it, embedded or institutionalised. And the prime example of that is around economic reform. Begun under Bilney, continued under Howard, continued. The idea that you can't throw aid to a country that doesn't have the right kind of economic policy settings. That's one thing that we've stuck to, and that's quite interesting in itself. Nonetheless, each successive engagement gets derailed, has been derailed, has done, and there follows a period of stagnation, waning enthusiasm. It's something that's very familiar in thinking about the Pacific in Australia. Low expectations. It's a muddling through. It's in Graham Bevel's term. I quite like Bevel. He's very good at coming up with pithy aphorisms. Cleverly managing trouble, he called it. So the high expectations which characterise the new engagement have effectively been eroded to the point that we're back to this kind of familiar lack of engagement. So that's my model. I'm going to walk you through a few instances of that, in the hope that a bit of evidence might convince you that it's got some legs. So starting with that, although I started with the crisis when I described it, because that's a nice way of describing the cycle, I'm actually going to start now with the final stage, the stagnation phase. The reason for that is the default position. Without crisis, we Australian policy community, the media doesn't report on the Pacific except for cyclones and that kind of thing, or kind of bizarre and unusual stories. I mean, the good work of Radio Australia notwithstanding, it doesn't very often go beyond the short waves and the international service. No Australian print media has a journalist, a full-time reporter in the Pacific. ABC has one in Papua New Guinea, but apart from that, a roving one based in Brisbane. This corresponds with, in my thesis titled "Overlooking." We sort of we muddle through, we overlook, we forget how important the Pacific is. We forget how long and deep our relationship with the Pacific Islands are. This doesn't mean that the advocates, the small but sort of interested policy community who care about Australia's engagement with the Pacific, doesn't mean that they stop pressing their case, but rather that they don't get paid. No one's wrong with it. The people that matter to make policy decisions don't pay attention to them. So, for example, going back to 1980, Vanuatu became independent. Colonisation was almost finished. Decolonisation was almost finished. It was sort of assumed that the French would get out of New Caledonia and French Polynesia. Australia's Foreign Minister Bill Hayden attached very little importance to the Pacific Islands. The engagement that we had was overshadowed by the logic of the Cold War. Aid was given without much thought as to how it was to be used. It was widely understood that the Pacific Islands had transitioned into peaceful and democratic states. And this was interrupted in 1987 by the Fiji coups. So that's one key period of stagnation. Another one, I would argue, goes from 1990 to 1993. So just to tell you what was going on around then, Gareth Evans was Foreign Minister. He'd introduced the constructive commitment that I referred to earlier, but then the Bougainville conflict had erupted dramatically. Australia had effectively given up on trying to do anything about. I mean, that's not true. They'd stopped being serious about it. They said, all right, there's this sort of low-grade civil war going on. But Papua New Guinea is an important strategic neighbour. We can't have them disintegrating, and we're just going to we're going to go through the motions of playing peacemakers, but it wasn't taken very seriously. I'll go a little bit faster. So those are two examples. I have some more, but time for these that prevents me from going through them in greater detail. The crisis, each time, as I said, this period of stagnation is interrupted by the emergence of some kind of crisis, and I think we can all relate to the idea that the Pacific is seen in Australia as periodically being beset by crisis of some type. But the key to this phase is less that there's a real crisis, but that it takes the perception of some kind of crisis to spur the kind of ministerial attention that it takes to reinvigorate Australian engagement. The source of the crisis can be quite varied. I mean, I can give examples when it's the minister's own sort of personal position, personal philosophy. It can be a political turmoil of some sort in one or the other of the island states. I think Fiji, I think Solomon Islands. Or it can be the emergence of a novel analysis within the Australian policy community. Again, think as the term was used at the time, economic rationalism, the economic reform agenda. Think the failed states analysis. There wasn't anything that really happened in 2003 that wasn't happening in 2002, but in 2003, failed states had legs. In 2002, it didn't. So the advocates, or as the term in the business goes, policy entrepreneurs, are the individuals that identify crisis. They succeed in convincing the minister that there is a crisis, there's a problem, the crisis is a problem, and this is critical, there's a solution to the problem, because the minister, the Pacific, because of, well, I guess it's probably common around the world, but it seems particularly strong in the case of the Pacific, that it's not much use telling the minister they've got a problem if you can't present a solution to the problem. And so you will see on occasion that people will talk about problems in the Pacific and not present a solution, and it's remarkable how those ideas don't get up. Not that they're not listened to, but it's just like, well, what do you want me to do about it? It's also really notable on each of the crises that the crisis, the problem, and the solution are informed by a totally new understanding of the Pacific Islands and of Australia's relationship with them. So, let me tell you about 1988 when Gareth Evans, so he foreign minister, became foreign minister after Bill Hayden went off to become Governor General. He came to office with this idea that Australia had neglected the Pacific. Yes, I was saying this was going on under Hayden, that they were newly independent, that there'd been a coup in Fiji, and that Australia needed to work out, it needed to have a doctrine. The Pacific Islands, they're not actually just these cute little places where we can go on holiday, but they're real countries with real problems, and then we have to relate to them as one country, one state to another state. So he came up with this idea, the notion of constructive commitment. And this really was the first time that there was anything which you could call in the post-independent period, a doctrine with respect to the Pacific Islands. That is, that Australia would encourage a common view of security in the Pacific, and it would use its power, but it would use it sensitively, and it would give development assistance. That was key, that it would give development assistance with the goal of encouraging a shared vision, and the whole thing will be underlined by respect for sovereignty. So it's a whole. This was quite new. I mean, this is quite a change from the other thing, which was, the French were here, the Americans, the British were there, they'd left. We don't really know what we're doing. Now we have a doctrine. It didn't last long, but that's the same on every site, every time. And maybe I'll just to come back to the most recent one, talk about what happened in 2003. In 2003, the Solomon Islands had been in a state of effective civil war for close to 5 years. Australia had made one serious attempt in 2000 to help facilitate a peace process, sending in unarmed peacekeepers, convening a peace conference in Townsville, but it really hadn't lasted, and things had gone from bad to worse, basically. The Solomon Islands government was being held to ransom by armed militants, public servants weren't being paid, the whole place had become quite dysfunctional. Into this, but as I said, this had been going on for some time. But into this came the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which at the time was newly formed. It was only formed in 2002. It produced a report called Our Failing Neighbour, which proposed, for the first time, in hindsight it probably seems surprising, but for the first time it used the word failing state, failed state, and applied it to Solomon Islands. It described in broad terms the consequences of a truly failed state in Australia's. You know, we don't need maps around to show just how close it is. It's a couple of hours flight from Brisbane. The idea that terrorists could take root there. They could not that Solomon Islands would become terrorists, but like the Taliban base themselves in Afghanistan, some kind of terrorist group could base themselves in Solomon Islands. For anyone who knows the Solomon Islands, the idea is kind of laughable, but because of the very close-knit and the very conservative Christian nature of Solomon Island society, but that idea had legs. And just to illustrate, so we have this crisis, we have this threat, but Our Failing Neighbour laid out exactly how Australia was going to address that problem, how it hypothetically could address that problem, which, not quite by coincidence, was almost exactly how Australia did address the problem. And that was to get together, assemble a group of like-minded countries, regional countries, to go in there with military, with police, to disarm the militants, and then to settle in for an extended period of development assistance, of institution building, of helping Solomon Islands once again to function as a state. Exactly what happened. So I've given you two examples there. The one of Evans in '88 and the one of Aspie in 2003. There are others, but just to continue around the cycle, the next phase is that of re-engagement. And again, I'm skipping between different instances of the cycle because I just find some of them are more exciting and more interesting than others, but believe me, I've gone through it in detail on every single one. But as I said, when the re-engagement happens, the foreign minister, occasionally the Prime Minister, but almost always the Foreign Minister, institutes a rapid and vigorous re-engagement. Several features are really notable when he does this, and I say he because it's always been a he, and maybe a she in another 6 months, but we haven't had a female Foreign Minister yet. The Minister has enormous freedom to reinstitute, to reorient Australian policy. That is, the institutions which, to take our relationship with other important partners, that act as kind of brakes and constrain to a great degree the latitude for action, really aren't there in the case of the Pacific Islands. So the Minister really has enormous freedom to do as he feels. And as I alluded to earlier, the re-engagement, 5, 2, 3, okay. All right. As I said, the re-engagement is hugely welcomed. Right across the political spectrum, we had Philip Adams call Ramsay the only foreign policy action of the Howard government of which he approved. We have Bob Brown, the Greens, just to illustrate the enormous welcome that happens. And then we have the interruption, which I talked about before, so maybe I'll just briefly remind you of what that was about, and then I'll go on to my conclusions. So we have either a Pacific Island leader actually getting up there, getting under their skin what Australia's doing, so they actually actively seek to undermine what Australia's doing, and that is what we've seen Michael Somare do, for example, when he got, or his government, I should say, moving. It's not strictly accurate, but just haven't got time to go into the details. But getting Australian police removed from Australia. From PNG, it could be Prime Minister of Solomon Islands, Nasir Sogavare, trying to undermine Ramsay's authority, or it could be the Pacific solution, the detention centres, or it could be the imperative to stop Papua New Guinea disintegrating, which meant that the efforts to contain the war in Bougainville were put aside in the interests of a national security calculus, which said that if Papua New Guinea started to splinter, we'd never see the end of it and it would be a disaster. So, all right, let me come there. Let's go to the conclusion, because we've got to say what can we learn? What can we learn from all this? Why is this of any interest to anyone other than someone who really cares a lot about the Pacific Islands? Which is a good reason in itself, but there are others. I think, especially for scholars of international relations, that it leads us to some questions about what it means for Australia to be a middle power. And the theory of the middle power theory, which describes the states that are neither great powers nor small powers, but is also usually accompanied by sort of a functional description. That is, they're democratic, they're liberal democratic, and I can't really remember what the other ones are. Excuse me, but a really key one is that they're nowhere regionally superpower. Or what's the word?
Soft power.
Hegemons.
They're nowhere a regional hegemon. That's right, exactly. And this is broadly contradicted by Australia in the Pacific. Australia is enormously influential in the Pacific. And so I find that it's no surprise that Australia doesn't behave in the middle power way in the Pacific Islands. It has the possibility to exercise power more nakedly there than anywhere else where it's interested. I mean, there are small fragile states all over the world, but nowhere that really matter to Australia except in the Pacific. So it's really no surprise that because we can, that we will sometimes, I guess. But even more interesting is that when Australia sometimes wields power it's asymmetrical power in pursuit of broader middle power, more typical middle power positions. And I mean, one of the things that middle powers are said to do, and Australia generally does, is to seek international regimes. The rule of international law is the most important to the middle power. The great power can go it alone. The small power has really got no choice but to attach itself to a great power. But the middle power seeks international regimes of cooperation. So it's perhaps the most interesting thing of all is when Australia kind of, should we say, bullies the Pacific Islands into supporting it to seek regimes of international cooperation. I think for an interesting example of that might be over when the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone was instituted. That is a classic middle power thing, except that Australia also wanted. The US wouldn't have a bar of it if it was going to prevent it from transiting its nuclear warships through the Pacific. So Australia effectively lent on the Pacific Islands to have them accept a treaty which they didn't want, because they didn't want they wanted it properly nuclear free, meaning no transit of nuclear ships. And so that to me is the most interesting thing. Maybe I'll just leave other broader questions to the question and answer session.
Okay.